keeping your blinkers on, or I've been informed that the term that Americans use for this is blinders. Keeping your blinders on, and how that applies to Qigong practice, how in a certain context that can be a useful thing, and in another context it's not so useful. That is going to be the topic of this episode of Qi Life. Alright, so what do I mean by blinkers or blinders? If you don't have to have ridden a horse to know this, but if you've observed horse riding, and particularly race horses, often they'll wear something on the side of their head, around their eyes, to keep them looking forward and not getting distracted by everything else around them. And that's really important, with, particularly for a racehorse, so that if there's any distractions in the crowd or anything like that, it's not turning its head around. It's not going to potentially stumble or something because it's paying attention to something else. It's just focusing directly on where it's going. Its footing's going to be more sure, and it's not going to get scared or spooked by things as easily, things like that. So understanding the application, it can fit pretty well into understanding the role of having your blinkers or your blinders on in Qigong as well. As I mentioned just right at the start of this vlog, sometimes that can be useful, and in other situations really not useful. There comes a time where it's, I would say, not just useful but important to take our blinkers, take our blinders off and look around us. So how is it useful to have some blinkers or blinders on us for our Qigong practice? In many ways, similar to a horse running a race. We might not be racing, we might be taking our time. But when we start learning Qigong, there's lots of new things to take in, things we're unfamiliar with, concepts to develop an understanding of. And there's a lot of diversity within Qigong practice. Lots of teachers doing different types of practice, talking about principles in different ways, and so on. And as I've talked about in previous vlogs, that can be a really good, I think overall that's a really healthy thing to have that diversity. However, when you're new to Qigong, that diversity can be really confusing, because you have one practice doing things a certain way, another practice doing them quite a different way, and they can even look similar, but they've actually got some different purposes behind how they're being done and why they're being done. You've got one teacher who describes things one way and another teacher who describes them another way. And you're like, they don't match, and maybe you apply someone's description to practice and it doesn't actually fit that well. Much like a horse, you're wanting it to get somewhere, having too many distractions, too many different interpretations, different types of practice, different descriptions can, one, it can mean you just wander here and there and you don't get anywhere, or it can also lead to you, tripping and falling, because you're like, I'm trying to do this, and then you're looking over here and whoopsie, and you don't actually do the practices you're trying to learn the way that you should to get the benefit from them, and maybe you mix some things together that don't mix so well. It can be a problem, or at the very least, less than ideal. So early on in your practice, early on in your study, oh goodness, there's a lot of trucks going past. Hopefully that won't be too distracting in the audio. Hopefully I'll be able to clean that out, but anyway, that'll pass soon, I think. Little distraction for me. Anyway, early on in your practice, I think it's good to look around to begin with before you decide what it is you want to dive into and learn. So, right to begin with, no blinkers, no blinders, look around, try a few things, see what you like, because in order to learn Qigong, you're probably going to have to put a fair amount of time and effort in. I mean, you can get benefit without putting a huge amount of time and effort in, but to really get an understanding and really get the deeper benefits, you're going to put a fair amount of time and effort into learning and practicing. And it makes sense to find something that you're happy to put that focus, that time into before you embark on that journey, so that you're really getting what you want out of it, and what's going to be beneficial for you. So yeah, by all means, no blinkers, no blinders to begin with. spend some time exploring to find what it is that you actually want to do, and also what teacher you want to learn with, because even for the same or similar practices, you'll find that different teachers have a different approach, and very, very healthy. Once you've decided on a course of action, a course of study, some practices you really want to learn, maybe a school you really want to learn with, it's then actually quite helpful to put your blinders on, to keep you focused, and just focus on those practices, just focus on learning from that one teacher, that one source, that one school, for a period of time, until you really understand it well enough. So you've got a solid foundation so that you know what you're doing. You can get the benefit of the practices that you're doing, and you're not going to trip and fall and stumble because you've got your base now. That's really healthy. Have those blinkers, have those blinders on for a while, be really committed, dedicated, not look around and try to do other things, not go looking lots of things up on the internet or reading different books or things like that. Just focus on what you're doing. Really helpful for a certain period of time. There comes a time after that, though, when it's not so helpful anymore, because you're only ever going to be able to learn so much from a single teacher. So this is one part of it, from a single teacher or a single school. Even a teacher who has a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, teaches a wide range of practices, you might learn a lot from them, and maybe that's going to be enough. So for some people, maybe keeping their blinkers, their blinders on to some extent, maybe that's not such a bad thing. Just to go, okay, I'm going to focus, I like this, I don't see any need to look at anything else, fine. Maybe that's not a problem. But there also comes a point where it's like, maybe there's something else out there for you that would be really helpful for you. Or even it's not so much that there's something else that you need to learn that's going to be useful for you, but rather that you'll get some more understanding, even of the practices that you're learning, right away, by looking more broadly, by seeing what other people are doing, other ways of describing things. Doesn't mean that you even need to start doing those practices. It could be that simply it gives you more context, more understanding of the practices that you're doing. So even at an intermediate level, I would say it's quite helpful to start taking those blinkers, those blinders off, and look around a little bit, get some context, get some perspective. Not until you've got a solid foundation first, but at that point, to go, okay, I see how things fit together, how they all relate to each other. I think that's really, really healthy. Then there's another stage that moves beyond that. Maybe as you start to become a bit more advanced, and in particular, people who are teaching extensively, I think there's a certain point where it becomes not just useful, but important to take those blinkers, take those blinders off, and to gain that understanding of context of how what you're doing, what you've learnt, what maybe you're teaching, relates to other practices and other schools of thought, other teachers, and so on. Because, well, one, again, it does enrich your own understanding. Even if you don't do any other different practices as a result of this, you get a richer, broader understanding. And in some ways, it also opens up the possibility of future development for yourself, of course, by, taking in some different aspects, some different understanding as well. And finally, it helps you to do a better job and be of more service to your students, the people who you teach. Because again, even if it doesn't mean that you teach anything differently, it gives you this context which may help you to recognize potential issues as someone's developing within their Qigong practice, and then to help them to avoid it. Or maybe with what's going on with someone, personally, in their mind, in their psychology, in their health, their physical health, things going on with their energy, to be able to identify other practices sometimes that might be more useful for them than the ones that you teach. And you might go, okay, well, I don't teach this, but you can steer them towards what is helpful for them. In some ways, I think you can compare this process to, to within academic study, how the process of academic study. When you start out, when you're we could even say when you start as a young child, you kind of, you learn from all sorts of sources around you. Maybe young children could do with having blinkers on them sometimes. But in particular, maybe you learn from your parents, you learn from your teachers, and a lot of that is just, you just accept what it is that they say, and maybe you get a chance to experiment with it for yourself. That's healthy too, to see how it fits, and so you know from your own experience. But it's just like, okay, you've got a lot of the time just one source, and you need to learn from that source. You need to learn the rules that your parents give you and keep by those rules, or learn what your teachers teach you and go, okay, I just kind of need to accept that at this point, because you don't know enough to question too much further than that necessarily. Maybe you do question, little kids going, but why? That's very common. But you just need to get the basics down. You need to get a foundation of understanding. And so just having that one source, really important. As you start to progress in your education, eventually moving through into higher education, college and things like that, you're going to start to read from different authors, to get a broader context, to start to form your own opinions, your own understanding in a deeper way. Beyond just your own experience, that's always key, that's always what you should come back to. But different sources that can inform where you even look to understand your own experience, right? And then as you go even further into higher education, maybe instead of just studying subjects, you start to do your own research. Maybe you want to publish your own research at some point. At that point, it's widely accepted throughout academia that before you are so bold as to write something, for others to, go into the collective source of knowledge, you first see what others have said, what others have written. So you can put what you are saying, what you are writing into context, into perspective, and understand how it fits in, how it relates to everything else that's out there. That helps you to do research that is more useful, more relevant, and also, again, to place it in the body of knowledge so others can get more benefit from it as well. I think there's a similar process in Qigong. Maybe it's not exactly the same, but there's this time where it's like, okay, focus just on what you're doing. And then there's a time to explore a little bit more. And then there's maybe, depending on how far you go, a time to explore really widely. Even if you still have your own area of specific focus, and you don't even deviate too much from that. Understand what else is out there, so you understand how what you're doing, what you're focused on is placed in the broader context. So I mentioned this because in the field of Qigong, much more so than in the field of education, this is often not the case. There are people who keep their blinkers on, keep their blinders on, sometimes for their whole lives, and they only know the little part that they know. And this can be, it can be quite perverse sometimes, because you'll get people who think, and this is the issue, they may have a whole lot of really good knowledge and understanding and practice about the area that they have studied, they have worked in, but a complete lack of understanding of all the other things that connect to it, all the other practices and applications and theory and philosophy and so on. But because they've got this good understanding with their blinkers, their blinders on of this one area, they think they are an expert on the whole field. And so they go, well, all Qigong is this. This is Qigong, that is not Qigong. Oh, what that person is doing is wrong. And it's just because they have no context, no perspective. And in my experience, this is more common in Westerners who have learnt Qigong outside of its broader historic, cultural context. more common there. But I have been quite surprised lately to actually hear of some cases amongst some Chinese, from mainland China practitioners and teachers sort of suffering from the same sort of issue. Now, it's not uncommon for amongst sort of, more mainland Chinese teachers and practitioners to have a really strong opinion that their way is the better way or the right way. Fine, everyone's welcome to their opinions. But they generally, again in my experience, at least have an awareness and understanding that theirs is not the only way, that there are others doing things different ways. They might disagree with them, but they know they're out there, right? And so they have that context. But yeah, I've been quite surprised to hear about from some people, people who completely unfamiliar with some basic terminology and how it's used very broadly amongst, most Qigong practitioners, and they've never heard of it. And they think, no, that doesn't exist. That doesn't exist because they haven't heard of it. It's like, wow, how narrow has their exposure been? They might choose to focus on different aspects of practice. They might choose to use different terminology, but to have no context, to understand that other people are using different terms. Now, there's always going to be more to learn, of course. There's always going to be, as I mentioned in one of the previous vlogs, came across a really interesting one recently at the NQA conference. Part of a quite substantial school who uses some terminology very differently from how most people use it. I was like, well, that's new, never heard of it. But at least having the context and perspective to understand that some people might be using terminology differently, And so that gives you a starting point for then developing understanding, rather than thinking, nope, the only way is the way that I know. And that might be actually quite narrow. You might be missing everything else that's out there. Anyway, this is probably a bit of a rambly one, but hopefully helpful to at least a few people, to give some context around this process, why it is useful actually to just focus on what you're learning, what you're doing for a period of time. But yeah, why it's, again, I'd say beyond just useful, important at some point, particularly if you go deep enough into it, to actually open up, see what else is out there, and get that context. It'll certainly, at the very least, enrich your understanding and may help you to develop your own practice further, and will help you to work in a harmonious way, communicate in a harmonious way with other practitioners, and help you, if you're teaching, to guide your students in a better way. There's so much good that comes from that. All right, I look forward to seeing you in another vlog soon.